Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Hopkins at Home. My name is Keisha Pollack-Porter, and I'm the Associate Dean for Faculty and a professor at the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. I'm thrilled to moderate the session today titled Black Every Day, a focus on policy and policing. I want to begin by sharing with you, in an opinion provided earlier this month, U.S. District Court Judge Carlton Reeves concluded that a police officer violated a Black man's Fourth Amendment rights during a traffic stop. In that opinion, Judge Reeves talked about how we live in an America where Black people are considered dangerous even when they're in their living rooms eating ice cream, asleep in their beds, playing in the park, standing in the pulpit of their church, bird watching, going for a run, or exercising in public, or walking home from a trip to the store to purchase a bag of Skittles. As the US examines the ways in which criminal justice and policing policies at the local, state, and federal levels affect Black Americans and community of color, many of us are left wondering about the role of our legislators and policymakers. Today, we're going to unpack that role and explore police, policy, and politics. I have the privilege and honor of also introducing our three panelists who we'll hear from today. We'll begin with the Honorable Senator William Smith, who has been a member of the Senate since December 2016, representing District 20 in Montgomery County. He's the chair of the Judicial Proceedings Committee. We will also hear from Senator Charles Sydnor III, who's been a member of the Senate since January 2020, representing District 44, which includes communities in both Baltimore City and Baltimore County. He's also a member of the Judicial Proceedings Committee. We'll hear comments also from Ganesha Martin, who's president of GMM Consulting. She works at the intersection of diversity, law, and police reform, began her legal career as a litigator and worked on police reform issues in Baltimore, Cleveland, and Milwaukee. We're going to use our time today by having each of the panelists begin with some opening comments, followed by discussion that I'll moderate with some questions, and then we're going to open it up to hear from all of you. I encourage you to post your questions to the chat, and we will get to as many as we can in our time together. This session will be recorded and available on the Hopkins at Home website later this week. So let's get started with some opening remarks. I'll begin with Will.
All right, thanks. Well, thanks, Keisha and our Professor Porter. And thank you for having us this afternoon, and thank you to the rest of the panelists. I'll just start off to say that obviously after the murder of George Floyd, there was a national uprising and a racial reckoning and a renewed conversation that had been long overdue to be thrust to the forefront and to the top line of all the newspapers and the headline of every news syndicate. And so you're starting to see a lot of the angst, the frustration, and the history that communities of color have been intimately familiar with. Now it's again forced to the front of our conscience. And so this is an opportunity for us in the policy space. We've provided, I think, a policy window where obviously there's a policy-making process where you give and you take and you go through the motions of that process. But here we found ourselves in a unique period of time in which we can focus purely on what's right to do, the right reforms. And we can kind of eschew the normal political process in terms of those pressures, those external pressures that come into the political calculation of too many politicians. And so I think we find ourselves in a unique opportunity. And so on June 4th, when I published the letter kind of basically kickstarting the legislative process in the Senate, that followed an announcement from the Speaker who initiated a working group in the House of Delegates. And so together, I think you're going to see the Maryland General Assembly put forward an option of reforms that are going to be very transformative. They've gone through, their work group has gone through several hearings. We are going to have hearings in the fall in the Senate. And so it's my hope that, again, just yesterday with Jacob Blake, we are seeing that this issue is not going away. and that we take this moment and we carry it into our legislative session and actually make some real reform. I'll say that, and I'll wrap up. I know we have brief introductory remarks, but I'll say that in 2015, we went through this type of a process. We went through this exercise after the in-custody death of Freddie Gray and the uprising in Baltimore City. And there was a work group that was established, and I was on that work group. And I'll say candidly that I wasn't vocal enough about some of the reforms that needed to have happened. And though we made several significant steps forward, I think all of us on this panel can agree that we didn't go far enough. And so now is our opportunity in the policy space to take and focus intimately on what needs to be done and move forward with that in the next couple months. So I'm looking forward to this discussion. Thank you for convening us, and thank you for opening the door to this conversation. I'm looking forward to the questions.
Great, thank you very much, Will. I'll turn to Charles for some opening comments.
Thank you, and I also would want to thank my alma mater for having this event this afternoon. Many of the things that we're talking about, I'll give Hopkins Professor Suzette Hemberger some credit. Back when I was a student, I remember taking some classes where we talked about law enforcement overstepping its bounds with programs like the COINTELPRO program and the like. And unfortunately, while we're talking about what's happening at this moment, I think historically, a number of the arguments that you hear Black people making, they're not new arguments. Historically, these things have been being discussed by some of our literary people for decades, by our political leaders for decades. And here we are again. Will and I both came into the General Assembly were sworn in back in 2015. And as he mentioned, later on in 2015, we had what happened with Freddie Gray here in Baltimore. But even prior to what happened to Mr. Gray, leading up to that session, we had issues that we saw across the country, whether it was Michael Brown's killing or the strangulation of Eric Garner. These issues are not new. And until we have some true policy changes, I suspect some of the same things are going to be going on. What I have found politically is you have some issues that some feel are kind of the golden egg, and you don't touch them, you don't criticize them. There's like this whole sense of an exceptionalism, and policing and law enforcement at times seems to be one of those things, those third rails that you're not supposed to touch. You're not supposed to critique. And if you critique them, then you're branded to be anti-police. So you find yourself many a times trying to justify, look, I'm not anti-police, but I do believe in good policing. I tell people all the time, I come from a family of law enforcement. My uncle was a homicide detective in Baltimore City. So I understand just from conversations internally with my family, the things that police go through. But policing is a profession. You take off that law enforcement suit or uniform. Well, my uncle does that. He is a Black man, as I am, and statistics say that we have more trouble with law enforcement than any other population. And I would say that I'd be legislatively negligent if I did not take up these issues to try to correct a system that is proven to be inherently dangerous to people who look like me.
Great, thank you for your comments to get us started today. And Ganesha, I'll turn to you for some opening comments now.
Good afternoon, and I echo the thank you for Johns Hopkins and the professor and all those behind the scenes for bringing us together today. Just as I was listening to the senator and the delegates speak, senators speak, I think it's apropos because we started this work together in 2015 to a certain degree when they were both new in the legislature, and I to my work in Baltimore City for police reform. And just to give you some context so you, the viewers at home, know where my thoughts are coming from. I'm a lawyer by education and training, never planned on working in the police department, but ended up doing that after being assistant deputy mayor of public safety, overseeing 6 agencies, one of which was police, other was health. Went over to be the chief of staff to the police commissioner. And then we started having shootings of unarmed Black men around the country. And I was asked to go up to the General Assembly and make sure that the legislation that was passed was actually something that helped the community and the police come together and not make it more divisive. And so I got a call the last day of session, or thereby, at least I was sitting in my office about to leave, that we had a young Black man that was in critical condition and they needed me to come back right away. I got back and it was my plan to ask for the Bureau of Community Engagement to be set up because I realized at the session how much the relationship was broken. The commissioner gave me permission to do so, and the next day Freddie Gray died. So it was my job to go into West Baltimore, to talk to the communities, to really actually understand that the relationship was not broken, it was eviscerated, it was not there. It was gone. And so in trying to work through that, we also then started negotiating the consent decree before the new administration came in. I went around the country to LA, Seattle, New Orleans, all these different places to see what people had done wrong and what people had done right. And came back and started implementing those things in the police department. And since I've left, I've been around the country, and it's unfortunate and fortunate, I guess, to a certain degree, that the things that I see in Baltimore City are endemic across the United States. And I just got off a call with folks from around the world and talking to police officers around the world, and it's the same issues. And so what I want to really bring to this panel, and hopefully the conversation moving forward, is while policy is important, accountability is even more important. We pass policies, we pass legislation. We've done that in 2015. And here we are again in the very same situation. Young people, on top of cars in Baltimore, 2015. It's the same thing we're seeing here. And so the one thing that I want to emphasize, to the senator's point about Eric Garner, is that chokeholds were banned in 1986 in New York, and he still died from a chokehold. And so what we really need to pay attention to, in addition to the policy changes, is the accountability. Thanks for having me.
Great, thank you for those opening comments. I'll just dive right in. Each of you in your opening comments reflected on or mentioned 2015, Mr. Gray, what happened there. And I want to sort of start there, and I'll look to you, Ganesha, first to provide some comments. Reflect a little bit on what was happening then to where we are now, in terms of what you've seen, what has worked, what hasn't worked, what has changed, what hasn't changed since 2015, and everything we learned from Mr. Gray's death to where we are today.
There were definitely some changes that happened that I think were beneficial for those to move forward. Cameras in the back of wagons. We've got the consent decree. There's certainly divisions on whether that is successful or not. I will tell you that I think that without the consent decree, we'd be in a completely different place. Not every police department needs that type of reform, but Baltimore City absolutely did. We now have one of the best use of force policies, a duty to intervene, a focus on the sanctity of life. I initiated training at the police department on how do we deal with young people. A lot of the uses of force were coming at the end of pursuits as police officers were upset or pissed or whatever it was that folks, ran from them. But obviously we know, as the senator said, sometimes that happens just simply because we're scared. And that was part of what, was even talked about with Freddie Gray. So there were a lot of policy changes, but I think people still ask the question, well, how can you have a consent decree and still have the GTTF? How can you still have a consent decree and have, video of an officer coming up behind a woman and hitting her so hard in the head that she literally, was not moving. And so I think that there's still a lot of work to be done. But one of the things that I want to point out is in 2015, we had protests. We had everybody coming to the foreground wanting to do something. And then when you have the opportunities for that policy and that training to be commented on by the community, when the emotion is not there, the community is not there. And I think the communities that need to show up and have their voice need assistance in doing that. These are often people with 2 and 3 jobs. They're focused on survival, not only from the police, but just with all the other endemic issues in their communities. And so I think part of what we have to do is help build that community up so that they can show up at the table the way that they did in 2015, so I can make sure their voice was heard in the consent decree. And the last thing that I'll say about that is that while we also have to look at how we hold our politicians accountable when we have local government, when we have these consent decrees, and making sure that in places, particularly like Baltimore, sometimes when we continue to have bodies drop, which obviously everybody has the goal to stop, sometimes reform gets pushed to the back of the conversation. And you start kind of saying, well, if you have to do that, then as long as you're stopping people from dying, then you're cutting the corners. And then that's how you end up with people like the GTTF.
And if I might say, just going back to 2015, what I remember is headed to one of our first hearings. I served on the House Judiciary Committee here in Maryland with Will, and it was just leading up into our hearing room. The hall was full of people looking to have some sort of reform occur. Out of that session, I think one of the bills that I had sponsored was House Bill 533. And we worked with our local Baltimore County government, and that bill was to lay the groundwork so that local governments could access and use body cameras, because up until that point, there were a number of questions because of the wiretap law, which many people might be familiar. Linda Tripp was prosecuted under, because while one could have video taken out in public, there was a question of whether or not it was legal, even for police, to audio tape sound. And we worked on that legislation, and I can remember during our voting session, and it wasn't necessarily clear whether or not this legislation was going to pass, but just trying to make the point that when you watch that video of Eric Garner being strangled before us, if you had a lack of audio and you just saw him motioning and doing what he was doing, you would not get the full picture of what was happening. But then once you laid that track of audio over that video, then you would see a man desperately calling out for help and saying that he couldn't breathe. I remember at the time the FOP, they were not fans of that legislation because they were concerned that it might be used as a tool by management to get rid of officers. And thankfully, that legislation, it got out of the General Assembly. And I can remember at the time, then the situation with Freddie Gray had occurred going on. And I went on CNN with Delegate Mary Washington at the time and just kind of asking that the governor make certain that this legislation was signed. Moving fast forward and up to today, I would guarantee that there aren't as many officers who were wary or suspicious of the body cameras as they are, I mean, back then as they are now. Nowadays, they actually have found they're good tools that do help to resolve some issues, and they've been bringing many of things to light that people in our community have been complaining about. The unfortunate thing is, while you had some who may have been proponents of them who thought that it would help to end police brutality, that has not been the case. We continue to see law enforcement that have body cameras on and engaging in activity that one would have thought they would not if they were filmed.
Mhm.
Can I jump in as well?
Yeah, of course.
We can provide some more, like, to frame that period of time, some context. Obviously, we had a work group, and Charles and I were members of that, and Kenesha was there as well. And so I think that I'll start kind of more broad and drill down in some of the specifics of the policy, is that, it wasn't just the FOP that were kind of rebuffing and fighting some of the reforms, so a number of unions, right? So the context we're all operating in is that there was one piece of legislation or one part of a statute, the Law Enforcement Officers Bill of Rights, that was particularly contentious. And I guess the reason why, apart from the actual specific reforms that were being proposed, was that a number of elements of that statute were collectively bargained for. And so the precedent that you would set by going in and kind of eviscerating that collectively bargained for piece of that statute was very offensive to a number of different unions. And so that's where a lot of that political pressure came from. And I've been reading a lot of, there's a law professor, Benjamin Sachs, out of Harvard Law School, a prolific writer on labor issues. And the thesis of a lot of his new writings is that if you believe in the labor movement, fair working conditions, fair wages, then if you're part of that ethos, then you'd look to your brothers and sisters and part of that labor movement and your unions, your fellow unions, and you'd say, look, if you collectively bargain for something that runs afoul of the public interest, you would stand up and you'd fight for that. That piece of the conversation wasn't present in 2015. And I think that you had a lot of folks that were new to the legislature learning those issues. And so just to provide some of that context, that's really where we're operating. So it wasn't just the FOP, it was a number of different unions. I think that has to be said. Second is the focus was primarily on the Law Enforcement Officers Bill of Rights, and as it is today. I mean, we're going to do some significant retooling. Folks have advocated for repealing and replacing. I think we'll dig into that conversation a little later on the panel. But I think that's, to Ganesha's point, that's kind of ex post. Like, so by the time you get to the Law Enforcement Officers Bill of Rights, which is really due process and discipline, you've already passed the point where that interaction and that incident has already happened. And so a lot of the reforms that are before us deal with before. And that part of that, package is the policy goes hand in hand with that transparency and accountability. If we have access to records, we understand where officers come from, if we have the right training in place, if the citizens have a real, involvement in that process, then there will be renewed and restored trust. And then you'll see that everything's interconnected in terms of public safety, because people will trust and interact with law enforcement in a different way, and in a way that's more positive and beneficial for public safety. But you have to start with the restoring of that trust and that transparency. And again, we're in just a different environment now. We have a policy window to really focus in on what's right. And what Charles and I both appreciate is that as legislators, the best thing about being in the legislature is the power to convene. We have access to experts from across the state and across the nation, and they can come in and help us understand the problems and the intricacies. We also have access to advocates and to citizens. And so if we are smart enough to go out and reach and embrace what they're telling us, I'm confident that this time we're going to get it, something right here. And so that's why I think conversations like this are so important. But just to provide a little bit of that context of where we were in 2015-16 timeframe.
Great, thank you. There's so much to unpack there. I wanted to touch on a point that a few of you mentioned, and this is for anybody. You talked about the powerful police unions, right? FOP, others involved in this debate. There are people that think we shouldn't even deal with the unions. There are other strategies. There are people who say we should really focus on unions and reform there. What are your perspectives on the role of the police unions in this space in terms of remedying what we're seeing in terms of policing in Black communities and communities of color?
If I may, I think first of all, we can't talk about unions as monolithic. There are some, I'll tell you, in some of the work that I'm doing nationally, I was looking to talk to some of the most racist police officers, whether they identify themselves as that or not. across the country, and I asked some folks that I know that are doing police work, for names, and the top name was the police union president in Minneapolis. This was before George Floyd. And we have since seen that indeed the person that gave me that name, it's well earned. I mean, he does, you know, he still supports even what happened, you know, in the murder. And so I think that's the first thing. I think the other thing that we have to then, when we break it down and come even to, and there's several different police departments represented around the panel, but in Baltimore City in particular, you know, if you did a poll, you would not find that many of the police officers actually are vocal participants in the union. It's usually in Baltimore City, unless it's changed, the retired police officers can vote by mail for the president. And many of them do not believe in reform. They believe in the good old way of doing policing. And so, first of all, I think there's that divide. And unfortunately, what the president says is then inured to the police officers. And I actually think they're doing, when they say negative things, blatantly racist things, they're actually doing the one thing that's opposite of what their job is, which is to create a viable work environment. They are creating an environment in which now when a police officer shows up in a uniform, people assume that they are racist and believe what the union says. So I think that they're out of bounds in that regard. I do feel like, though, this time around, before in 2015, nobody was really talking about that. And Senator Smith is absolutely right that those other unions that represent a lot of Black folks who have probably been oppressed by the police, and putting that pressure really was the break there. But one of the things that we have to focus on is, I've been on several panels, one of which Commissioner Ramsey, who was in Philadelphia, in Washington, and actually co-chaired President Obama's 21st century policing plan, said he fired 2 police officers twice for horrendous things, and they ended up back in the department. I have been in police departments across the country on my consulting, where I have seen text messages where the word "in" was used. There's no question here, and they were fired and brought back. And so, you know, I think we have to find this middle ground where police, a lot of police say good police don't want to work with bad police, but they're also scared to stand up against the union. So there is some ground there for us to, I think, try and define what is a healthy environment as police and community define it as, and try to push forward in that. And I don't know if we're going to talk about defunding, but I think the same thing can be said about defunding, right? And there is a middle ground, but those who don't want to see us come together keep making it very, very divisive.
I think it's a general, if it's okay if I chime in here. As a general, I'm not the moderator, so I want to make sure.
No, please, Will. Well, I was just about to invite you into the conversation.
Okay,
Thank you.
All deference. Sorry. I think as a general just point of view, I don't think, you know, having a police union is something that is a negative, right? It's actually, I think it's a positive thing for people to be unionized, especially for public sector workers to have a union to secure rights. I think where you get into the space that we're in right now is when you've collectively bargained for things that run afoul of the public interest, and when you have excess due process. And when you don't have a charging board, you have officers sitting in on that. You have your fellow officers sitting in on adjudicative boards. When you have extra time to understand the case, when you have a higher degree of due process, that is what runs afoul of the public interest. When you can have access to your disciplinary records, all of those things run counter to real public interest. And that's where I think that's the territory that we're in right now. And so look, for the other folks that are in labor, you know, they should look toward this moment and say, look, real reform is really needed here, so that there is some transparency and accountability, and so that the chiefs have the ability to exercise their discretion and get rid of bad officers without having them being charged with a felony, for instance. So, I mean, there are lots of things that we need to change within the Law Enforcement Officers' Bill of Rights, whether it is repeal, replace, whatever. as we move forward. But there are lots of things that should be offensive to every citizen in Maryland, that there's this added layer of extra due process. But the general premise of a union in and of itself is not offensive, and is actually something that we should all support, because we want every worker to be protected with fair wages and great working conditions and opportunity. But that should never run afoul of the public interest in terms of transparency and accountability. So, you know, I'll leave it there.
Okay, thank you. You mentioned the Law Enforcement Officers Bill of Rights, and this is the question I have. There's also a question from one of the audience members about this, and love to hear any from either Will or Charles on this in particular. You know, in terms of policy strategies, are people considering a repeal, or are you expecting it to go to that place this year during the General Assembly, during the legislative session? Can you talk a little bit about what we're hearing in terms of Law Enforcement Officers Bill of Rights?
So I'll chime in real quick, Charles, I'll just real quick.
Right on ahead.
I know we're speaking, but so I would say that, for instance, the one thing to understand about the Law Enforcement Officer Bill of Rights is that it does set the floor for discipline and due process throughout the state. So there are 148 law enforcement agencies across the state and that sets the floor. So if you were to get rid of it, the default position would be whatever those 148 departments have on the books. And some of them have the Law Enforcement Officers Bill of Rights verbatim on the books, and it would have no effect whatever on that. So if you just repealed it, you actually may create a lot more work for yourself if you're a reformer, because you'd have to go and have 148 fights instead of just one at the state level to get it right. And so I'd say just be wary of that element of the process. Yes, the conversation has talked about repeal. A lot of people think that it's completely offensive, that there is extra due process that no other public sector employee gets except for the police. And people find that offensive and say, hey, look, we just got to repeal it and start fresh. There are other folks that say, let's work within the statute and say, let's make some critical reforms of charging boards, disciplinary boards, have some citizen involvement, make sure that the chiefs have a little bit more latitude, make sure that the interrogations are recorded on videotape or digitally and memorialized forever. There are lots of reforms that we can do within the statute as well. And so when we get into our hearings in the fall and then we start session in January, that's when the rubber's gonna hit the road. But I'm looking forward to hearing those full-throated discussions in our hearings in the fall, in September, next month.
Great, thanks. Charles, did you have something to add to that?
No, I think we'll pretty much hit the nail on the head. My colleagues, I think all of we kind of run the gamut of whether the things should be replaced in its entirety to a repeal and replace type efforts. I know this past legislative session, there was legislation, I believe, and Will can correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe it was on behalf of for the MTA, to ensure that the MTA police organization or agency fell under LEOBR, because for some reason that particular police department did not fall under LEOBR. And I can recall when speaking with their lobbyist on this issue, when they were talking about sponsorships, just asking, well, if they don't fall under the LEOBR now, how are these officers dealt with? And it's under the general system that any other employee for the state it was dealt with. So there are systems that are out there. I talk to people who have prosecuted these cases, and they feel that it gives the officers a bit too much power. And the fact of the matter is, I think when you're talking about authority and everyone is looking at your police commissioners and your chiefs of police to kind of rein in some of this behavior. But if there are certain roadblocks in their way, as Ms. Martin talked about, where you can't get rid of these so-called bad apples, then those systems need to be deconstructed. And I'm hoping that is what is going to happen in this upcoming session. Again, we did some of it. In retrospect, we certainly didn't go far enough. But as Will said, I think at the time when we came in, we were new legislators just trying to figure a number of things out. We have a little bit more experience this go around. So hopefully we'll be able to work together. We'll have the public behind us, and the public hopefully will get involved. I'll say just a few weeks back here in Baltimore County, we had legislation, local legislation that looked to make a number of changes in how our Baltimore County Police Department was operated. And unfortunately, our chief of police came out against legislation. She felt that the policy changes that her and our county executive were doing were going to be good enough. But the argument was, well, administrations, they come and go. If you don't want this stuff happening, we need to put it in legislation. And this is and that legislation, unfortunately, my councilman, Democrat, he tabled it, which essentially killed the bill. So people need to understand that if they want change, they have to get involved. I mean, legislators, we're delegated some authority to try to move discussions forward, but the public, if it's important to the public, they have to get involved. I think at the hearing, we may have had about 50 people engaged in talking. For reform, we had the police union out here in Baltimore County and our state's attorneys talking against the bill, which goes to another thing that, and I know we don't have time to get into, but we focus so much on police that we forget that there's an entire system, and the police are just one cog in the system. You have to have state's attorneys. You have to watch what they do. You have judges. You have us. I mean, the kind of laws that we pass. I mean, are we criminalizing too much stuff and then asking the police to then do things that maybe they shouldn't be doing? Maybe we should have other professionals doing. I mean, this is such a huge discussion. And I had to get that off my chest. I know we're just focusing on policing right now, but there's so much room. I mean, I'm reading a book now called Charged that talks about the state's attorneys and their authority. And I see Senator Smith shaking his head because I've been saying, look, we need to look at state's attorneys as well. I put that out there because I want the public to begin looking at these things. I mean, you elect your state's attorneys here in the state of Maryland. Look at what they're doing. Are they prosecuting like you want them to prosecute? And by that, I don't mean is everybody being thrown or pushed to go into jail or prison? Do they have a justice mentality? Meaning, are they trying to prosecute the people who actually caused the damage or the harm? Those are the people who should be in prison. Sometimes that doesn't happen. Sometimes you have prosecutors who are just looking for victories, and that's not justice.
Yeah, I really appreciate that comment, particularly around the recognition of the system, right? Like there's not just one piece, so much of the conversation, and I, Ganesh, you said earlier, I don't know if we're gonna talk about it, I'm gonna bring it up. You know, there's all these calls to defund the police. The police is one part of the broader system, right? You can defund the police, but how are we addressing the rest of the system that also needs to be addressed? And also, part of that call is to take money from the police and move it into other systems. Well, a lot of those systems, if not all of them, have been impacted by institutional racism. And so we're going to continue to see racial inequities exacerbated. So I was wondering if there are thoughts that you want to share around this call, appreciating the system, or around defunding the police that you want to bring to this conversation?
So two things, and you know, this perspective comes from working in city government for over 10 years. You know, when I came back, my last role, I forgot to say this, I went back to the mayor's office to be the director of Mayor's Office of Criminal Justice, focused on juvenile issues and how we can improve those systems. And I started asking questions. So I'm asking state and federal and local organizations, both private and government run, can I see your statistics? So like, here's your program, and this is how many youth went through it. and like what happened to their life, what was the efficacy, those sorts of things. Like I can't tell you how many rooms I got laughed out of. Like we don't keep that data. We keep how many come in, how many go out. And then when you talk to the actual communities where we tell police officers, well, refer them to this system or whatever, to this program, they can't get a call. When the person comes there, they don't understand their experience. They're asking them questions that clearly show racial bias and discrimination, kind of this, all sorts of things. And so if you talk to the people who are part of these systems, they will tell you that while their life in the sense of a gun, or their freedom being taken that a police can have, there are several implications around the fact that there is structural racism in a lot of these social services programs. And so and if you look at police budgets, right, and just how money is managed in governments, it's not always efficient. Right. And so just taking money from police and then throwing it somewhere else and assuming that's going to help Black and brown communities is completely foul, flawed thinking. First of all, the second piece that I would say about that, at the police department, I started the co-responder model with both a clinician. That's something that the senator, put forward when he was a delegate, some legislation, a co-responder model. We have a mental health clinician and a police show up. I was only able to find money and foundations for about 5. And that was after a year of kind of beg, borrowing, and pleading, right? When everybody's saying this is an issue, I couldn't find money for it. I also started a LEAD program. That's basically when there's low-level drug offenses, instead of sending people to jail where they're not getting the treatment that they need, they can be referred to services. I had to go find money for that outside of the police department. And then when we did the homeless outreach team, which I don't think police should be showing up for that ever, because they show up with guns and badges and tasers and all those sorts of things, nothing that helps that person. The police officers, I found out, were buying, bus tickets for people to go back home, paying for them to stay in hotels out of their own pocket. And so we came up with a budget. Police officers on their best days are not trained for these things. People go to school, they get clinical backgrounds, all those sorts of things to handle these issues. And police don't want to do this. And so the defund conversation is really being more divisive. And I can't stand to watch it, because the truth of the matter is if we brought the right police to the table and we brought the other folks from these social services, because there really is not a great model out there, by the way, to just start defunding. But we bring these people together, including the affected communities, and start talking about what it should look like, and then create those structures, that it makes sense. But it has to be done because both sides want it, and our communities deserve it.
Thank you, Ganesha, for that. I want to shift gears and there's so many questions coming in through the chat. I wanted to just lift one up around training. Training's come up in our conversation, and in terms of, what are we doing for police cadets? Are they being, is there a thorough psychological vetting before they graduate from the police academy? Are they exposed to mental health resources? Is that the place where we really need to start this conversation if we think about changing policing, to start in the academy? And
I'm going to 30 seconds if I can, just because this was part of what I did, but even to segue to that defunding conversation, when I started looking at recruitment and our issues along this pathway when I was the chief of staff at the police department, and I started seeing that Black candidates were thrown out of the process way earlier than everyone else and at larger proportions, I started actually looking at the psychological vendor. When I went to go look at the psychological vendor, their questions, they were Black led, by the way, were, did you grow up in a home with a single mom? Things like this. What does that have to do with psychological well-being? So even their test was biased, right? The other thing we found was that, young Black men were being thrown out for marijuana, usage. If you had 20 times in a whole lifetime, you're gone. That could be one weekend in college and you don't do it anymore. We had that changed, but a lot of those things have to be looked at. The training, I'm going to say this and then I'll be quiet. It goes back to the accountability. We teach people bias training, right? So you're not a racist. Everybody has bias. Okay, I realize I have a bias against Jewish folks. I'm standing in front of a rabbi right now. What have I been taught on how to change my behavior? Nothing. I've just been told that I have a bias. And so again, we keep talking about this training, de-escalation training, use of force training, mental health training, cultural competence training, all of this training. First of all, there are varying degrees of whether it's good or not. And then there is no accountability, no measurement after the fact of whether it actually did what it purported to do. So I think that that should be part of the conversation, the accountability. And it also hurts the police officers, because when you sit them in that classroom and tell them this stuff, and it's not up to par, it makes it easier for them to ignore.
I'll just say that I appreciate I really appreciate what you said, because that highlights a lot of the problem that we're running into in terms of in the policy space. So obviously you have 24 jurisdictions in Maryland. They all go to their respective training academies. And then we all know training is perishable. So you need kind of re-education annually and even quarterly. But what happens is that the Police Training Standards Commission, which is responsible for kind of establishing, again, that floor for all the jurisdictions, we have a lot of good training in place. And a lot of the local jurisdictions have done a lot of innovative things with de-escalation and with implicit bias training. They've done a lot of great innovative things. That's not uniform across the state, of course, but there's also there's no accountability for the Police Training Standards Commission to go around. They don't have enough resources to go around and make sure that all of this is being implemented on a regular basis and that it's actually good. There's no quality assurance. We don't have the resources to ensure the level of quality assurance that we would all kind of go to bed at night, thankful that we did. And so I think there is a real problem there that we're wrestling with the Police Training Standards Commission and resources. But I do think that there is some training that we do need to focus in on and reevaluate with de-escalation, close quarters defense, for instance. I mean, there are lots of things that happen that are taught in the academies that experts will tell you, hey, look, this is not, chokeholds, knees to the neck, even sweep kicks. Like, these things are all employed against subjects that are already not resisting, or it can't be employed against people that are not resisting. So, I mean, if you even get down to like the granularity of what's being trained, some of it's fundamentally flawed. So that's a discussion that we're looking forward to having in the fall as well. But I really do appreciate the accountability and the resources part of that conversation, because that's something that a lot of good ideas have been around for a long time. We just haven't had the focus and focus in detail and attention on the resources. Now, that does dovetail with that defund conversation. And obviously that movement, I respect the movement. That movement exists on a spectrum, to full on abolition to reinvestment or reimagining. In Montgomery County, we have a $5.9 billion budget. $288 million goes to the police force. And so our council is now going through a reevaluation process and trying to understand how they can reinvest, but understood that you can't just throw money at a problem and expect that it's going to help Black and Brown communities. And so I really do appreciate what Kenesha said on those 2 points, because that resonated with me. And as we've been walking through some of the reforms and some of the standards we're looking to change. So yeah, I mean, message received for sure. That's definitely a new challenge that we're looking to address this session.
And in talking about the psychological test, I can remember back, I think it may have been in 2015, 2016, there was legislation that was passed that wanted to do, I believe, annual psychological examinations, because I believe something is done at the forefront when prior to men and women becoming police officers. But the fact of the matter is, when you're engaged in this type of activity, it's gonna have some sort of a psychological effect on you. So it just being done at the front and not periodically is problematic. I think the arguments and the things that we heard is, again, I think some officers they were concerned that by submitting to psychological examinations, they may subject themselves to those evaluations then being used against them and then losing their employment. You had officers who, I believe, and I think this is something that's in the general public, when you go and you talk to a psychologist, you may feel it shows some mental weakness, and you don't want people thinking you have problems and can't do your job. I believe that the cover of having the evaluations done across the board actually would have presented those men and women that opportunity, that they would not have had to feel like they were kind of singling themselves out, because everybody would have had to sit for them. So I mean, that is certainly one of the benefits of having these things done periodically. Now, whether it's every year, every 2 years, that's a discussion that will likely be had in the upcoming year, but it's something that should be done.
You've each mentioned accountability in your responses today, and talk to me about what you see is needed in terms of policy responses to really increase accountability for whatever part of the system, whether it's the police or prosecutors. Help the audience understand sort of what policy strategies you think we need to see. That's for anybody.
I'll jump in one just real that hasn't been discussed, and that's independent investigations for the criminal side of the house. And so that's one part of the things that have been bandied about for a couple of sessions, long before I even got into the legislature. But the fundamental problem that we're looking to address is that too often you have prosecutors and you have police officers who are on the same side of an issue, right? They're participating in the same type of investigation of an incident, and so it's hard to for a prosecutor, from the outside looking in, saying, look, you're going to be responsible for pursuing a complaint or a claim against a criminal charge against an officer that you so often work with. And in smaller jurisdictions, that may be more pervasive in the sense that, the courthouse is a small place. You obviously worked with that person, socialized with that person. You may have too many conflicts. And so that independence in investigation, I think, would not only be something that's appreciated by the public, but understood that's real transparency, that's real justice there. So the options that we've been talking about would be whether to nest a unit of sorts in the Attorney General's office or the Office of the State Prosecutor. And so we're looking into those two things, but that would end a real era of accountability and transparency when you have an independent body responsible for doing those investigations. Now, obviously you're going to have local involvement with investigators and so on, but you're going to have to, I think, investigations are a critical part of that. In Montgomery County, I think we're the only jurisdiction that has an MOU. So if there's an officer involved incident like that, we have an MOU with Howard County. So the Howard County investigates things that happen in Montgomery County. Montgomery County investigates things that happen in Howard County. That ends an era of transparency and lends more credibility to the process for all of us. So that's something we're looking to implement statewide, but more to come on that as we develop that idea.
I think with our Maryland Public Information Act, it's been kind of used as a shield to protect certain misconduct by our law enforcement. Back when I was a law clerk at the Baltimore City Circuit Court, I can remember riding through Edmondson Village. I had just left a friend's house. It may have been sometime after midnight, but being pulled over. And after, I'm assuming after this officer ran tags and my identification and the like, he let me go. And with the explanation that I was stopped because I ran a yellow light. Now, to my knowledge, going through a yellow light was never anything illegal. So I know what that was about. And I filed a complaint. And at the time, I didn't understand everything with the law, but I never heard anything. And I remember calling back, trying to find out what had happened, and I couldn't. In fact, I think I then ran into another officer who ended up getting smart with me as I'm trying to figure out what's going on with the system. So I filed a complaint against them for talking to me the way they did. I've had an incident just about two or 3 years ago that I wrote about in an op-ed where I was stopped in Virginia for driving too slow. Now, the reason I was driving too slow, I saw a police officer behind me, and the first thing that you do, you want to make sure you're not driving too fast. So I decreased my speed. I thought I saw a sign that said the speed limit was 45, so I dropped it below 45. Come to find out, the speed limit was 45 on school days. Otherwise, I think it was supposed to be 55. And I was pulled over, and this was in front of, we were on vacation with my family, and I had my wife in the seat and my 3 daughters. And just the way that this man was speaking to me, and I can tell the difference from an officer because I've been stopped other times where they speak to you with respect. This man, I don't think respected me, and he spoke to me in that manner. Again, you file a complaint, but now I understand, so I have no expectation that I'm going to hear what happened to that officer, and that's wrong. If these officers are performing badly, the public should have a right to know how they were disciplined. So I think we need to be looking at that type of legislation, and I suspect that we will. So there's a number of things that could be changed in this system. But again, we're going to be met with resistance. So the public has to make certain that they're involved, and we need to, and I think sometimes what's missing and what's been so encouraging about watching what's happening across the United States today is a lot of times there's a lack of empathy. And I find that some legislators, because it seems to be happening and because we're framing this in the manner that this is happening to Black people, they don't empathize because they can't see themselves or it happening to them. But the fact of the matter is it does happen to non-Black people. But just, again, what's been encouraging is seeing the diversity and the people who are saying, you know what, this really is an issue and we need to speak up. Systems need to be changed, and that's been so encouraging.
The other thing on that note, just to dovetail with that, when we had the Department of Justice come in to investigate Baltimore City Police Department after the in-custody death of Freddie Gray, we actually had to figure out some legal maneuvering so that the DOJ could see the personnel records of the police department. I think that's in part too why the federal legislation is pushing that both Senator Harris / VP and Senator Cory Booker put forward around subpoena power, for the Department of Justice, which just seems kind of ridiculous in these types of, but we did that. We did that workaround. But if we did not want to work with the Department of Justice in Baltimore City, they would have had serious issues with that law. The other thing that we haven't really talked about, but that is an issue both at the federal level, at the state level, and some of the legislation that was passed in 2015, and certainly what communities are talking about and what we're talking about is transparency, is data and technology. And, especially in this defunding conversation, I think if a chief or a commissioner asks for money for technology, everybody would look at them crazy. But the truth of the matter is, and this is what happened in Baltimore City, if Ms. Johnson is saying that the police squad, on the B shift is stopping Black boys and men disproportionately, and then a good chief, a good commissioner who wants to hold himself, herself, and the department accountable goes and tries to press a button to see what's going on, but their stop tickets and everything are over in a box somewhere, or it's a handwritten process or something like that. So there are record management systems, RMS systems, that actually are built towards consent decree and reform type of efforts, where a police department that is trying to hold themselves accountable and then also be transparent with the community can make that work. In Baltimore City, to the senator's point, I tried to come up with a dashboard where you can say, I filed a complaint, it's being investigated, it's finished. It's so that they can go to the website and see these things. I'm working right now on a transparency portal where communities can see those things. The last thing I'll say is from what I looked at in 2015, there were some legislation passed where police departments are supposed to report in on uses of deadly force, I think excessive force, things of that nature. I don't know that they actually ever started doing that. And so that's one thing that I certainly hope we look at, is reporting mechanisms for all of the police departments across Maryland, so that we can actually this is not a gotcha game. It's like, let's start looking at the data, let's see what we're doing, and then provide to Senator Smith's point, the resources, the technical assistance, those sorts of things to help them bring themselves up to best practices.
And I just point out, say and that data is being reported. In fact, I had, in the discussions that we had in Baltimore County, I went to that web page and saw and pulled a few of the reports, and I was astounded. I think Baltimore City, when it comes to deadly force or people who've homicide has happened, it's Baltimore City, Maryland State Police, and then Baltimore County. And I remember sharing that information when Julian Jones was pushing efforts out here in Baltimore County. And most of us were shocked that Baltimore County was up there in terms of these extrajudicial killings of people.
Yeah, well, thank you so much. We are just about out of time, and I just want to ask Will, in terms of the transparency comment you made earlier, you said these hearings are coming up. How do people find out more information? What's the best way for people to follow what's happening with hearings, and are they going to be recorded? Can people watch them?
Sure. So we want public participation. We'll make the announcement. It's going to be the last 2 weeks of September. I just saw some emails come across while we're on this with councils trying to organize that. So we'll roll out the announcement probably by the end of the week, but you can definitely watch it on YouTube. Go to the Maryland General Assembly website, watch it on YouTube. We're also inviting public comment and testimony. So submitting written testimony, but also testifying. Because of COVID, we're going to be doing it over a platform like Zoom. So no in-person testimony, but we want everyone to participate, and definitely stay tuned and watch and provide your feedback afterwards as well. So.
Well, thank you so much. Really terrific conversation. I'm so sorry that we're out of time. I could talk with you all for another hour. Thank you for your time today, Senator Smith, Senator Sidnor, Ms. Martin. I really appreciate all of your expertise. I want to thank the Hopkins at Home team, particularly Sydney, and the tech support from Hero and Kevin. And thank you all for being with us this afternoon. Really hope that we gave you some additional information to unpack and to think about, and really hope you embrace the call to be involved. We need to hear from you around these important policies, and we need to hold our leaders accountable and really encourage you to really express your voice in this process. So thank you so much. Take care to all of you. Have a great day. Bye-bye.
Thank you.